Great. All right, so week two, we're doing our philosophy class once again. We're going to be covering Plato again, Republic, Book 1 and number 2. Now, there are 10 books in Republic, but the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to focus on certain areas. Happy if people want to read far more. There are lots of things that I mention and reference anyway, but this will give us the idea of what Plato is trying to talk about in his work. So, as I said, 10 books. It's really a question of what is justice. So we're continuing from the same concept, and you'll find a lot of where I'm starting will face this issue, because until we know and we have an idea in our own mind that we can answer like to ourselves, how do we feel about justice, then we're going to have a few problems. We're not going to really understand many of the other ethical dilemmas that might come. If you're going to do things like Kant and argue about what is right or wrong in treating people, then, well, we haven't even thought about justice yet. So I'm going to look at the questions and definitions, books 1 and 2, what that means, end and purpose of art, which actually relates to it. So we're going to link that in, strangely enough. Origins of war. There's some of that in the writing of Plato in Socrates. Censorship by the state, a major thing at the moment. That differs greatly from censorship by third parties, though. So right at the moment, we have a different argument. If Facebook or Twitter or something like this are so large, what rights do they have? What can they and can't they do? And there are other aspects of this. Censorship isn't just, well, I'm not allowing people to talk, like saying things that are fraudulent. There's no right for that. That's not censorship. That's just stopping crime. Should we seek justice in the state and not the man? Plato would have that we should. So let's get into it. What is justice? So, hard question. We've got the lady with the scales there. And as we're looking at this, we've got to remember what we covered last week. We covered Crito and the Apology, and we have Socrates himself choosing to follow the state, even though he doesn't agree with the law. So next week, we're going to have a different sort of view on that when we go to Sophocles and we investigate both old Rex there, Oedipus, and Antigone. Then we're going to start thinking about alternatives where people don't do the same as Socrates would do. So every person, as it notes there, is going to follow like a decision on justice, injustice, etc. We can't go through life without this. We're going to always have to decide. It's not the don't judge not, lest ye be judged, but that's the point. We are always judging. We will always be judged. So when we're doing this, the effect of justice. So what does that mean? But if we can't even answer what justice is, not an easy question. If we don't understand the society that we're in, then how do we even think about right and wrong? Is there an innate sense? Now, it's been argued, but also discredited, that humans all have this innate sense of right and wrong. Now, there are some things that we have. For instance, in-group behaviors within tribal groups generally forbid murder, forbid incense, but outside of the tribal group, that's different. If we look at traditional native groups, even 100 years ago, outside of the tribal group, murder was fine. Even now, in some areas in Papua New Guinea, murder's fine. This is why we'd see 30 to 35% of males die from murder in these sort of societies. So,
well, can I just give a play devil's advocate on this one?
Please do.
That maybe they all know that it's unjust. Are you sure that they still don't have an internal sense of what's right and what's wrong, and they're all just choosing to do what's wrong?
Well, I mean, everyone could lie. I mean, but there are a lot of anthropological studies that cover all of this. And inside the tribe, then right and wrong. But outside, then many times it's not a person. So if you look at even the Native American groups, many of them didn't see the people from Europe as people at all, but they didn't even see alternative tribes as people. So they would go out there and be happy to torture people from other tribes, but not their own.
Okay, well then,
Yeah.
again, let me play devil's advocate because so you said something. I don't mean to. I'm probably going to get your words wrong, but you said something like the idea that we have an internal sense of right and wrong has been discredited. But what I'm hearing from you now is we do have an internal sense of
No,
what's
no, no,
right
no.
and wrong.
That's not what I said. A universal one.
Okay, got it. Okay, so in other words, it's the same issue of the tribe versus the outside. So we
Correct.
do have an internal sense of what's right and what's wrong for the tribe, but it's not universal because it doesn't apply outside the tribe.
That is
Or it may
correct.
apply differently in a different tribe.
Yes, and it's the insider outsider, us them mentality, and you could even argue that some of that's Darwinian because people in our tribes help us, people outside don't.
Having lived in New Guinea for a few years and worked there, it definitely, you hear things, people say things like, oh, they'll kill me if that happens. We were told if we're ever in a car accident, didn't matter if we were the driver, where a local person died, don't stop, don't get out, don't help, drive, find an adult, get on the first plane and leave and never come back. Because you're essentially there'll be a mark on your head, and they believe it's their right to kill you for that. So
Yeah,
that's their sense of justice.
Well, eye for an eye. I mean, going back to the old law in the Torah, the nature there is tribal, and tribal law is very much us and them.
Well,
So,
Aboriginal lore says if you terminate the body of another, then that spirit has the rights to your next incarnation. In Aboriginal lore, that's why there's so much multidimensional ramifications for warfare when you go kill people in another country. That's why supposedly from Aboriginal perspective, why we have so much suicide of those veterans, because there's spiritual consequences for terminating the life of another being.
I think that's probably also tied into the us and them mentality as well. Before Protestant religion, where everyone is in sort of insider as all others, then we had all these different groups, and as all different groups, we're not actually doing something bad. We're not killing that person because they're not a person. And to many tribal groups, people outside their tribe are not people. They might be bad spirits. They might be out there that sounds okay, but many times they're just others. So let's go back to this, and we have our conscious. Where does that come from? Doing right, wrong, etc. Can we profit and get away with it? The old ring of Gyges issue that I've mentioned many times. Do we feel that we are right when following might is right? Which is another question here. So looking through the 10 books, I recommend all of them. Now, the thing to remember though is when we're looking at this, it's not just the Republic, the state. We have a combination of different topics. So the structure of the book really works well for modern society, but it doesn't always flow. So people will sit there going, he seems to jump between topics. But that's because of the nature of using a dialogue. And when we're talking, we don't always follow a linear pattern and go straight to the point. So Socrates will jump between the state, he will go back to politics, he will go into different areas, even art. And because of the Socratic method, the use of communication and talking, then what we're going to do is have questions addressed. Plato there, with his sort of caricature of Socrates, doesn't answer everything either. So that can be unfulfilling to many people. What he's trying to do is get us to have the examined life. What do we believe justice is? So if you read all of this, Socrates will sit there going, I don't know. What do you think? And then someone will say, oh, justice is X, Y, Z. It's all through the book. And then, of course, old Socrates will sit there going, oh, isn't there a problem with that explanation? So what we're doing in the dialogue is exploring different options. Might is right is one of them. So as we're going through all of this, we've got to remember that definition is critically important. We see that in Bitcoin world, but it's everywhere. If you can't define what you're talking about, then how do people know that they're even talking about the same thing? I mean, it's a big issue. How do you actually know?
Yeah. I mean, if I could just comment, because this is, I think you said this in your article, Craig, and I've identified this myself just by being in lots of arguments with people over time. It is very, very often the case that when people argue about something, that they don't actually agree about the terminology. And so their argument is completely just wasting everybody's time because they haven't agreed about the terms that they're using. So we need to agree. If we're going to discuss justice, somehow we need to grapple with the definition of justice. Otherwise, what are we talking about?
Yeah, so if people have different concepts and different outcomes, then we might be talking at cross purposes. So this is one thing that philosophers will always sit there and do, sit there and actually structure what we're talking about first. We'll sit there and define all of these things, sit there and argue before we even get to the problem, and which everyone out there in the real world will sit there and going, oh, it's a whole pile of waffle that never gets anywhere. But that's also super valid. If we can't define what we're talking about, there's so many different variations of what a word can be in the English language, and it changes over time. Different people have different ideas. So how can we argue? Think of a straw man argument. You tell me what a straw man argument is?
Well, you instead of attacking the actual person, you build a straw man and you attack the straw man instead. So it's just a way of winning an argument when you haven't won anything at all. You're just attacking.
That's true, but what I'd actually say is the straw man is a mischaracterization of the argument.
Okay.
So you take part of it or you take it out of context and you change it. So you alter the argument so that it looks ridiculous, as an example, and then come back and go, well, that's obviously blah, blah, blah. You can even take quotations and have them wrong. Now, many ways of doing it. I mean, I was actually reading something, a textbook on straw man arguments actually over the weekend, and not taking sides or anything like this, but there was a whole chapter involving Mr. Trump, as academics like to do, and it wasn't a pro or con, against or for. It was rather talking about in 1999, Donald Trump said, and then looking at the different ways that different media had portrayed this. And Donald Trump said a statement about he's pro-choice, but sort of also can see a perspective for abortion. And depending on how you paraphrased it or said it, you get different answers. And I won't go into his what he said or means. That's not what we're doing here. But the different media came up with completely opposite versions of what was said. Now, in doing that, what you're doing is using a rhetorical device, what old Plato would sort of argue with Socrates as a sophist, a sophistic sort of method, allowing someone to avoid the actual question. So as we're going through this, what we've got to consider is if we're going to have an honest engagement, the first thing we can really do is get to understand the perspective of the other person. Otherwise, we're going to go back and forwards thinking that we're actually correct or right or saying thing that's valid and not even really arguing with the person.
Yeah, but can we just consider the Trump question slightly longer? I mean, a lot of people are intentional in misunderstanding Trump so as to mischaracterize his position publicly to make him look bad. So how do you argue with people that they're not even trying to argue legitimately? They're trying to mischaracterize something. They're trying to mischaracterize Trump on purpose to mislead people.
Oh, I agree. But then you have to go back and look at the actual evidence of what was said. And that's the difficulty. It means taking something in context and reading it fully. So
okay.
It means work. Not all of us want to work. So we can all profit from an engagement with people, but that doesn't mean that we're going to. So let's start with Book 1. Now, Book 1 of the Republic, we're really setting up a series of dialogues between Socrates and First Cephalus. And we're going right into the question of what is justice. So Plato in this is really involved in trying to argue that. And in the story, Polemarchus, who was the son of Cephalus, is then continuing in the discourse and really goes into definitions of justice that can even be seen as contradicting the ones we've already seen. So an example as a position is doing good to your friends and harm to your enemies. So that's one example of what someone might say is justice. Would you agree with that one?
Well, no, but that reminds me of the tribalism idea. Like your friends are the people in your tribe, your enemies are just everyone else. And so
exactly.
that definition of justice is essentially the tribal definition of justice. So no, I don't agree with you. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I wouldn't agree with that.
Agree with that? Sorry, say it again.
I was just saying I wouldn't agree with that, but as you say, there are certainly places in the world where that is what justice is seen as. So,
exactly. Now, as we're reading, though, we'll see Thrasymachus basically takes charge of this argument and now argues further into justice is the stronger, the interest of the strong. And we even hear that argued now. We hear that the elite are doing X, Y, Z, and it's not fair, and we need to make everyone equal, etc. Justice is in the interest of the strong. And that position is put forth and defended. And Socrates looks at an alternative and demonstrates some of the contradictions in there. So in a very Randian Ayn Rand fashion, I will say contradictions don't exist, not in the real world. When we find them, there's a problem. So there are always going to be contradictions found, but that just means we have a problem in what we're trying to say and do, and we have something that isn't right. Even in mathematics, when we sit there and we go, oh, I've found that there are contradictions in math. Well, I would actually argue that it's the mathematics at that level is not perfectly aligned with reality. It's a great tool and it's very close, but we've got problems and we have this system that we understand, and unfortunately the rest of the universe doesn't fit to what we want it to be. So old Socrates here never actually sits there and says, hey, I know what justice is. So in the thing there, I put a little bit of a quote. I put there, I shall not today attempt further to define the kinds of material I understand to be embraced within that shorthand description, pornography or obscenity, and perhaps could never succeed in intelligibly doing so, but I know it when I see it, and the motion picture involved in this case is not that. In this, in Jacobellis versus Ohio, the rather famous quote, I know it when I see it, referenced the concept of obscenity in movies, etc. Now, the justice was saying, well, that's not pornography, but I can't define it. But what I can do is I can tell you that is. And I think in some ways the problem with justice is we can start to learn that is not just, but it's so complex to put down a simple explanation becomes hard. I mean,
Yeah.
like justice, I know, like pornography, I know justice when I see it. So, Cephalus talking about the advantage of wealth, the great blessing of riches. I do not say to every man, to a good man, that he has no occasion to deceive or defraud others, either intentionally or unintentionally. So, if you're rich, does that mean that you're going to be a better man? I mean,
No, I
you
think
don't
that's
need
pretty
to.
simplistic.
Mm.
It's an assumption made by someone else who is just that everybody else who has wealth will also be just in the way that they apply their wealth.
Yeah. So Socrates responding, of course, well said, Cephalus. I replied, but concerning justice, what is it? To speak the truth or to pay your debts? No more than this. I mean, is that really all that justice is? Paying
Can I
off
go
contracts?
further? Can I
Sorry?
say what strikes me when I read that it seems exactly the opposite, if anything, because it's the rich and the powerful that don't need a justice system because they're rich and powerful already. So to define justice as just whatever they get, it's like, well, this is the whole point of having a justice system, as far as I'm concerned, is to counterweight the existence of rich and powerful people who have the things aligned in their favor already. So if anything, it's precisely the opposite of what he's saying there.
And how do you even tell what your debts are? So you might have debts to society and you say you don't have them. What is truth again? If you can pay people to act for you or cheat, is that just? I mean, if you can defraud people and get away with it and be richer. So,
well, if you're defrauding people, you're not speaking the truth. So I guess in the context of the statement,
but what if you can do things like you can read, because what I see going on right now, without getting into too many details here, I see people literally redefining terms almost day by day. And so what they can do is they can define truth however they want to. So if you're rich and powerful, you have so much control already that you can always win an argument because you can just change the dictionary or something and change the definition of a term and win.
Well, I would say there's only one truth and you get to define your opinion, but really that's not truth.
Yeah, but the problem is
you can convince people that your opinion is the truth, but the truth is the truth.
It is, but how do we know it? And that comes back to that all the time. We don't, I mean, if we focus on something, that's what our experience. So, I mean, it's the old psychological experiment where people are concentrating, watching, following numbers, and a gorilla jumps across the stage in front of them, and people go, "What gorilla? I didn't see any gorilla." So, I mean, so going back to this, we sort of go back to old Polemarchus there. Polemarchus, of course, defends the view that we've seen about debt, etc., looking at Simonides, who had stated the repayment of debt is just. So the old, he's an authority, and off we go. And Simonides, basically, after the manner of poets, would seem to have spoken darkly of the nature of justice, for he really meant to say justice is beginning to each man of what is proper to him, and is what he termed to be a debt. And from that, we have to start looking at what is really due to each individual. So Socrates were to be guided by the analogue of the preceding instances, then justice is the art that thou gives good to friends and evil to enemies. So while that might be there, we need to think a little bit more. Is that really adequate? I mean, does it answer the question of justice? Even expanding that out. What if we take that as Socrates did and introduce the position of a pacifist, a Quaker, for instance, Brotherhood of Friends? What if we now say that injuring another person is always bad? A lot of Hindu people and Buddhist people might say that because next life, etc., any injury is bad. So if then a man says that justice consists of the repayment of debt, and that good is the debt that a man owes to his friends, and evil is the debt that he owes to his enemies, to say that he is not wise, for is not true, as if it has been clearly shown the injuring of another can in no case be just. If it's always unjust to injure another, then isn't that not just?
I would not argue that what is said here is justice. Dealing evil to your enemies is just a sort of a propagation of, I would say, injustice, because when you're an unjust person, your enemies are the just, and to define justice as an unjust person doing unjust acts to just people is kind of it's a contradiction.
Yeah. Can I say, I want to say what I
Certainly.
think is almost is what you just said, but with slightly different words, Brendan. I would say, imagine two different tribes, tribe A and tribe B. And in tribe A, they think, what's just is good to friends and, or you're wrong against enemies or whatever. So what's good to them is actually what's wrong to the other side. And what's wrong to the other side is what's good to the other side. So you can see the contradiction when you lay it out that way. There's a contradiction. Well, what is unnet just? Well, it can't be that, because you would always have a contradiction. It would always be perceived as being unjust to the other side. So if you're aiming for a consistent definition of justice, that wouldn't be it. It couldn't be.
There are some ancient cultures that believed in modern physics discoveries of quantum entanglement, like the Zulu tribe in South Africa has a word that means humanity, and it's translated "I am because we are." And they understand in some tribes and Aboriginal cultures that anything you do to another, you're through quantum entanglement, in whatever philosophical terms you want to say it, you're actually doing to yourself, because we are all just reflections of each other. So not all ancient people believed that eye for an eye, or, in just going around hurting other people because they weren't part of your family. I mean, there's a lot of information that's actually been suppressed about more of this connected universe philosophy they don't want us to be looking at.
Yeah, can I love the phrase Ubuntu, and then I just always follow on with my expression is what Jesus said in the Bible, which is love your neighbor as you love yourself, which is extremely similar to what you're describing here.
It's the belief in a universal bond of sharing that connects all humanity. So if you look at modern physics discoveries that are actually being suppressed, it really provides the knowledge of a connected universe through quantum entanglement of all humanity and living beings on this planet. That's the Hadron Collider at CERN is proving, like, when you take, the molecule and split it and you do something to this one, the exact same thing happens to this one in real time, because we're all quantumly entangled. So
I won't go there because, I think it's too much complexity, but that's a different matter.
Sorry.
But as we're doing that, I'll just put a bit of background music as I'm talking. Frankie Goes to Hollywood, two tribes go to war. But anyway, getting back to this, Thermachus and others. So we have Polemarchus getting a bit annoyed and not wanting to continue the argument. He's getting a bit stubborn. I mean, that's one way of getting rid of a part of an argument, isn't it? So what about if we represent justice with evil, the virtue of justice, we make it a vice? So we can give different lines of argumentation. So different perspectives, different individuals are going to see things differently. But then, of course, remember, Socrates is a gadfly and he wants to make people think. So Thermachus is argumentative in book 1. If you read further, you'll see that it's a bit different in book 5. So the same individual also can be friendly or aggressive or domineering in different types of environment. So looking at what is right is Thermachus is not really Socrates' idea. So it doesn't really convince Socrates there. So now we get into the actions of the stronger individual, of course, being just because they have power to produce a just outcome. The strongest individual always acts in his own interest. That doesn't mean everyone's interest, of course. So let's think of what that means. Is the state always going to be right in some sort of Hobbesian sense? If the state and society where people are citizens and owed, the rule might be there. Like we have Socrates himself choosing to die rather than fight against an unjust ruling. And Socrates, of course, makes the comment, there is no one in any rule which, insofar as he is a ruler, considers or enjoins what is for his interest, but always for what the interest to be subjects or suitable to his art, to what he looks, and what alone he considers everything he says and does. Now, thinking about what we're saying, there's no individual who's going to just think I'm the ruler and I'm going to be equal and fair. That's why we have all these checks and balances. So,
would you say that the way that Socrates died, the fact that he, walked down and took his punishment, and despite being offered ways out, and the fact that we still talk about it today as an example of an unjust law being applied to a just person, is that not almost the example that he was trying to set, that this is where an unjust law is being applied unjustly, and I'm going to serve as an example of this moving forward through history? And
I don't think he knew quite as much as he would have an impact, but in part, yes. So it's not anonymous. It's not sitting there using deceptive methodologies on Twitter or Facebook. It's actually putting yourself at risk, and he did. So to continue that, even let's think about the next section on what the ruled and the rulers are. The citizens or subjects. I mean, if we're talking about a traditional autocratic kingdom or even North Korea, then we don't have citizens, we have subjects. We compare that to the modern democratic system, and what we're really looking at is a leader who should be a shepherd. A very Christian idea as well, although we're going way back before Christianity. But this is why many Christian medieval scholars and authors and theologians quite liked Platonic thought, and then also Aristotle. So if we're thinking about a shepherd, he's not controlling the sheep for his personal interest all of the time, but he is, in his own way, controlling them for his gain. So he's managing the flock and keeping them healthy and safe to provide not only the shepherd with food, but also for the interest of the sheep in the short term. It is basically there for the sort of growth of this, but not just the whim of the shepherd. The shepherd thus is multifaceted. He is going to make a meal out of the sheep, maybe, but for the moment, in managing the herd, he's basically trying to grow things and make more. So there needs to be something. If the shepherd takes too many sheep, he won't have a flock. Yet there needs to be some way of keeping the shepherd alive too. So
yeah, as a king, you need to be able to raise an army, collect taxes,
Exactly.
do all of these things that you need to keep your state alive. But if you're too vigorous in doing that, you'll end up with a revolt on your hands, or or a famine, or who knows what kind of outcome. So there's a very much a balancing act there.
Exactly. So I mean, it also helps not to try and just be a subject or become sheep in this way, because, well, we know what happens to sheep. They get shorn and things like that. But equally, as a ruler should be trying to grow the overall herd, growing something in prosperity. So we need an idea in thinking about that of justice, if we want it to be valid, to have a system where everyone's given their due, but also the people in the society must give back for that. So we have human rights, we have citizenship rights, but there are duties associated with that. So, but we need to get beyond the concept there, like Socrates and Polemarchus were arguing on this point, where it becomes a circular argument. So, definition of justice in that was if we demonstrate that where a ruler is giving each subject their due, that which is given to the subject must be justly offered. Well, circular argument. What is justice? Justice is that which is just. Well, look up just. Justice is that which is just. Just is the delivery of justice. Great. That teaches us a lot, doesn't it?
Can I make a point? Because this comes back. I long ago I wrote an article called "The Infinite Curiosity Loop," which is the idea of literally every single word in the dictionary is defined in terms of other words in the dictionary. So you can play this game with any word, actually. I mean, it's not just justice, it's every other word in the dictionary. Well, what is the definition? I don't know, but it's defined in terms of other words, is it not? So why are we, I mean, what is the big deal about justice in this respect? Because it seems like it's a unique aspect of society that when we're dealing with other people, we have to grapple with this word with others in a way that that may not be true for other words. But why do you think that we have to grapple with this word in this way specifically rather than all words?
Because if you look at the definition of justice, it's very circular. Other words go a lot further, and the overlap between meanings allow us to define things. If we want to look up dog, it's in the dictionary, and we can figure out what a dog is, and we can describe a dog, and it might not be perfect, but generally people can tell that Chihuahua and that Great Dane are both dogs.
Okay. So then let me, if I can just slight tangent here and just try to understand this concept. It seems important to me. So in other words, some concepts in the dictionary are so basic to the human experience that there is no argument about what it is. So the color red comes up as an example, a lot of times, or a dog, as you say. Let's just run with the dog example. You can see a dog and point at it and say that's a dog. And then every human being universally recognizes dogs. It's so basic in our human experience that we can recognize it. Are you saying that justice is different from that it's harder to define in this sense?
Yes, it's really something that us humans define differently in different societies and cultures. So I'm not a big fan of the Republic. I mean, a philosopher king should have been ruling, and there should have been different class-based systems, and he didn't like democratic rule, even in like a Roman Republic where there are different, like the Senate and a balance, but aristocracy and sort of the people balanced different levels of power, but all to their own. I actually find that old Plato there is a little bit more towards the communal, personally. So he's got some ideas, but we have to think what they really lead to. So let's get to some of my favorite areas here. In book 2, I've written some blog posts on this one, the old story with Glaucon. So we've got the Ring of Gyges. Now, this is a old story that seems to be told many times. If we look at Lord of the Rings, for instance, the ring of invisibility, but we have to add extra powers and things. But back in the time of Plato, there weren't any extra special powers. The Ring of Gyges made you invisible, full stop. Think about that. So everyone now goes, oh, but invisibility, what else? Invisibility and. Do I need invisibility and? So think about what that means. If we have Gyges ring and we can go rob a bank and we can do anything to different people, we can sneak up to them at night and no one can tell we were there. No DNA in this sort of world. So we're talking about something where if we have nobody watching us, we're in a society where we're completely anonymous. And I think this is a big issue to be discussed in modern society, where people believe that being anonymous on Twitter or anonymous on any other form of social media is their right. Think about that. We're creating people who believe that they have nothing that can happen to them. So
yeah, well, you're setting up a situation where where they believe they can get away with anything, and there is no justice to be done, no matter how they behave.
Correct. So in the old argument there by Socrates, the whole monitoring of each other and noticing what people are doing in society minimizes some of the problems in society, some of the crime. Socrates would also probably be an early proponent of the idea by Galton in 1907 of the wisdom of crowds, where many of us sort of together, without getting into problems, can argue something based on a collective sharing of knowledge better than we would together. It also, we can even see that in Machiavelli. So appearing to be just. So Adeimetus goes into the argument now of how people can appear to be just and gain advantages. So there's an effort in really being just. There is an ongoing effort here. So imagine instead, what if we just have people think that we're just? I mean, Machiavelli said in The Prince, why don't we do that? So how about the state? It needs to look just, but is that going to have us in a society that is just?
Not necessarily. If
Exactly.
it only looks just.
Well, this is what's happening on Twitter. So they have the problem, like you said, Craig. They, like, for one thing, you see they've sort of redefined justice. Like whatever's popular on Twitter is their view. You can be anonymous. So they hide behind the ring of Daiji because you can't see what's really going on. And so they get a bunch of engagement on Twitter. And what they're doing is they're creating the appearance of justice. Okay.
Yeah. So we have both genetic fallacy and ad hominem, two fallacies all in one as well.
Yes.
We can just attack the people rather than the argument. Rhetorical sort of problems after rhetorical problems. So, I mean, look at my personal case. What happens is people go, don't look at him, he's blah. Or he doesn't have a degree. Well, actually I do, but I can't really argue I don't have a degree I've got to show you the damn thing. And the next thing it'll be, oh, it's fake. It's on the university site. Oh, they got hacked. Well, they've checked it. Oh, it's plagiarized. The university checked it. They took it down. They put it back up. Something else is wrong. Except, so you can always make these sort of arguments. And do you know what we've done in that? We haven't actually addressed the original question. So we sit there going, oh, this person's bad. But we're not arguing the person. We're not on trial for murder. We're not doing these things in a court. What we're sitting there doing is arguing a point. So it shouldn't be. If Hitler walks into the room and says, I think that we should give free milk in schools, and then walks out. Well, we can't sit there and go, well, that came from Hitler, it's bad. I mean, argument ad Hitlerium. What we've got to actually look at is that a valid thing? Okay, someone's got to pay for the milk. Is it worth the benefit to the children versus the cost? That's an argument. Sitting there going, oh, this person said. And once again, back to justice, we can't look at who said. When we can't also just consider whether we appear just. So moving a little bit further on old Socrates here, we're still even having difficulty defining a just state at the moment. So we have to keep going. And Socrates also talks about the state of luxury, a decadent state, a luxurious state. So imagine something that doesn't have a trained citizenry, a trained soldiery. This is something that was really, really important to the founding fathers in your country, right? They worried that the virtue of the young men would not be high enough in the future. They worried that if people didn't keep training and educating themselves to be better, that we would have a society of people who don't understand both the needs and consequences and duties associated with being a hegemonic power, even before they were a hegemonic power. Just the what does it mean to be part of a democratic state? So the problem here is when you have something like America, what is like they did with Athens, then you have something that has a lot of economic wealth. It's accrued by the people throughout the country, and guess what this does? It breeds resentment. And we allow this. This is one of the things we do in social media. We sit there going, it's not fair. It isn't fair that they have more. So if we look at productivity for a second and we go, Alice over there can dig one hole and she can do that every day. Bob can dig two. Why shouldn't Bob be rewarded for digging two holes differently to Alice? If we give them the same, isn't Bob just going to only dig one hole?
Yeah, exactly. Well, yes. I mean, yeah. People should be paid in proportion to their productivity, in my opinion.
Exactly. So if we now continue with that, though, as we have a society like Athens in the past or United States now, what happens is we breed resentment to other countries. Just as Alice can sit there going, it's not fair. I should be able to dig. I mean, if I was able to dig as much as Bob, I would get more. Maybe Alice is sort of not as strong. Maybe she's lazy. Maybe something else. Maybe she's older. Who knows? Not the point. But this resentment means that we need to defend nations. So in order to protect the economic wealth, others will take it by force if we don't. So it's got the anarchic position of state versus state. There's no overall government, and we have envy, and this is part of the cause of war. It's not just, oh, it's not maybe not fair, but many of these things are fair. I mean, this is where we have the anti-colonial movement right now. There are good and bad colonies, and what I will say is every single society on Earth is colonial in their history. They're all part of empires. I mean, all of these countries complaining used to be empires. So they're saying, I mean, if you look at Afghanistan, it's been an empire. It's been part of many empires. It's been part of kingdoms. It's been part of all sorts of things. And yes, they've been taken over, but they're not the original people. They're not the original culture. None of us are. We are all mixed, all part of a whole sort of amalgamation of different things. So there's an interesting book that I've mentioned in here, Heinlein's book, Starship Troopers from 1959. Now, the book is very different to the movie. That's the first thing I'll say. Now, in this, Heinlein introduces a militarized society. So to be a citizen, you need to actually serve in the military. You cannot be a politician, you cannot be a citizen unless you have served. That doesn't mean you can vote when you are in the military. It is more like in Switzerland, where they have national service, or Singapore with national service. You have a duty that part of what you have to do. So if we think about that, then how do we protect society? Do we just say it's someone else's job, or do we expect people to understand? So one of the benefits in Switzerland or Singapore of national service, which many countries have had in the past, is that you learn and you understand some of the problems behind all of this. And I mean, what we're really looking at now is Athens then, people were required to provide military service. So we all talk about how it's not a real democracy because, well, only some people got the vote. There were only a few people franchised. But maybe that's part of it. Maybe there's a duty for people to actually be part of a society.
Can we pause and go back to something? And I got a question to ask about this, but I'm going to start with something because there seems to be a basic principle here that I'm not sure is clearly true to me. So the idea of that one nation state becoming wealthier than another breeds resentment. I'm not so sure about that. I don't understand why people would have to be resentful. Why can't you look at other people that are well off and think, oh, wow, look at that. Look at how great those people are. I wish I could be like that. Why does resentment come out of that? Is that really true that it always breeds resentment?
No, not always, but we're in a big world and it's very anarchic. So there might be some people who go, oh, that's really nice. You're doing well. They're probably in Canada. They're probably Canadians, and they're probably going, oh, you Americans are doing really well. I'm so happy to be next to you.
Okay.
Remember,
so then
we burnt down your White House. That one.
So the point then is, so some people could have this sort of, I don't know, the positive way of looking at it, being happy for you, but it's in a large world inevitable that some people will be resentful and envious in these. And so that is why the military's requirement is that the argument? Is that correct? Like that's where Socrates is saying something like, this is why you need military service to defend the inevitability of resentment from the other nations or something.
Well, think about it for a moment. Imagine if America became completely pacifist tomorrow. Imagine if they got rid of all of their armed forces, the whole military-industrial complex.
Yeah.
Well, what do you think would happen?
Well, if that was the only change, we'd be screwed. we'd be taken over by somebody. But
North Koreans, yay!
But I want to throw out, I'm not totally sure. I'm not totally convinced that a military is a requirement. I'll try and explain why. Because I think if the nation were ungovernable, if we were so decentralized that there was no centralized tax apparatus, nor were there anything else centralized to be taken over at all, there would actually be no gain to be made by taking over because there's nothing to take over. So if it was totally decentralized,
you'd not be a country. You'd break down into little tribal groups at that point. Almost. That's
what it would be. It would be substantially less unified if it operated that way. It would be an ungovernable. Yeah, that's just how I can.
Land? Let's start with land.
Yeah.
I mean, do you think North Korea would not mind some? Lebensraum, the whole Nazi reason for invading Crimea, into Russia eventually, not just Poland. We need living space. We need land.
Yeah. So if there were no unified, defense, it would just be so tempting for someone to go in. Oh, there's one guy with 1 million acres of land or something like this. And it's like, well, that guy has such weak defenses. North Korea goes in and just takes over some giant plot of land in the middle of the U.S. or something.
Yeah, they wouldn't even need to fire a shot. They just drive their tank around and squish people.
Yeah.
I mean, So that's why the United States was built upon what they considered a system of virtue. So thinking about the Second Amendment rights to bear arms, it was premised on being part of a militia. I mean, if you think about that phrase, the duty to keep a militia means you have the right to bear arms. But we seem to have forgotten that part, and a lot of the American people don't seem to understand that defending your nation was part of why you have arms, forming the ability to have the equivalent of a national guard and being part of it. So the Swiss, as I've mentioned before, have national service. Now, interestingly, there are more guns per population, per head of population in Switzerland than there are in America. But there are far lower sort of problems with gun violence in Switzerland. But everybody's trained, everyone's part of this, they know their duty, they end up very Swiss. That's part of it.
You're saying that so then the training and education is key to that.
Yeah. I am.
Well, it's assignment of a purpose to the gun ownership. They own the gun because they can be raised as an army at any moment. Whereas in America, it's become now you own a gun simply because you have the right to own a gun. And there's not really any other reason outside your own want that allows you to do that.
It really strikes me, the education, it keeps me back to this, but the education piece is so critical because what I think is going on is the education system is so terrible in the U.S., and I'll speak for the U.S. primarily, but I gather it's...
Well, I'll call it a training system. It doesn't educate anymore.
Yeah.
It's about training.
Exactly.
Disinformation and training.
Understand. Because if they did understand the way the Swiss do, and if what you're saying is true, that would make all the difference in the world. It's like, but see, this is a problem. This is like a flaw with the system because the education system seems to have been taken over. It's like the interests of the education system are no longer what the people would actually want.
Well, blame both Dewey and FDR and the progressives about 100 years ago. They had all this idea that everyone would be equal and the whole world will be suddenly nice if we just have more books and more education. These people would just kind of forget their backgrounds. They're going to no longer like monster truck rallies. They're going to suddenly start listening to Beethoven and neglect a certain Clockwork Orange with a person who loved Beethoven as well.
Yeah.
So anyway, so we have all of this in the past and we need someone trained, but that's always the pacifist argument to it. We're going to not have any of this and everything's going to be good. And how do you stop people doing something bad? Yeah, don't really have an answer for that one. So let's get into the question of justice here with these very white guys who are not God. Book 2, we've got this debate continuing. So old Glaucon and his brother Animes, horrible names to pronounce, I'm not very good at Greek, going into our ring of Gyges, and guess what? We have external forces can change people. They can alter us. So we're looking at an unjust man or ruler. What happens if they have more power and they don't have control? We can have basically a Machiavellian idea of power and the prince, and that in itself can change someone's heart. So we've got an argument that a person can still be a good or lead a best life by maintaining the appearance of justice, even when they don't believe in themselves. I don't know if I agree on that one personally. So can you act just and seem to be more? So,
well, okay, yeah, it's an interesting thing. I mean, you know, yeah, I mean,
look at any of our current politicians.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, like I think the idea of acting just and not being just is a problem, but it's hard to not also put forth effort to act just and be just. Like how I mean, would that really work? That people could be just and not also look just? Because
if you can control media, I mean,
they can be painted as unjust while they're in fact being just. And
or vice versa, you can be painted as being just while you're actually doing something wrong until you get found out. So, I mean,
and that sort of falls both ways. Everyone can sort of realize after the fact, oh wait, that guy was actually not doing the wrong thing. And but as you said before, Craig, that's a process of learning. People actually have to go back and reanalyze what was said at the time, what they were told about what was said, and realize, hey, there's a big injustice that's been done here. This person was actually not what we were made to believe.
Well, that sounds very relevant.
It is very
100%. Yeah.
So Thrasymachus basically argued that if someone's not careful enough to hide sort of his rotten heart from the general public, that can be a problem for him. So the censor of your fellow citizen may help, and it may help the state. So ironically, Plato actually saw the censorship as a good thing, because like any collectivist, Plato said, well, people aren't going to like this society if they know something more, but it's best for them. So we want to have the philosopher king who can tell them how to act, and we want to have the military keeping it safe, and we want to have people in their roles. Oh, Plato there and I don't agree on this one. Plato's sitting there going, okay, so we're going to censor because if we can't hide different opinions, then people might not really think this is the best state anymore. Maybe they won't be a farmer. Maybe they'll protest and go study poetry. Yeah. I mean,
did Plato really believe that? Because when I read it, it looks to me so obviously ridiculous that I find it hard to take it seriously. So
you've got to remember, 2,600 years ago. So Plato had also just gone through a period of change. So Plato came from a period when there was a tyrant, an oligarch, to an aristocratic oligarchy that sort of were in control, to then one of sort of demagoguery and a lot of French Revolution style retribution. And what he saw was demagoguery always comes out of democracy. Now, the answer that, say, the American federal papers, the Federalist Papers, the Founding Fathers, and following Rome saw to that was you have to balance it. You have the Senate, you have the people, etc. Now, in the early days of Rome, that was fine. The change to the number of people, etc., the senators didn't want to add more senators. That caused a whole lot of problems that led to collapse into an empire. Equally, in America, the system's being degraded more into a pure demagoguery, a democracy, a rule by vote. The rule by sort of balancing wealth and power and people and everything like this is changing. That's not how the American system was actually originally constructed. So you can go, oh, it's people power. Well, it's not just people power. You need to have the systems, the companies, the institutions as well. So those things, they're virtual people in court, but they're not really virtual people in voting. Not anymore. We moved away from that. So the irony there is, though, because of FDR, Roosevelt, etc., the concept of a bureaucracy that was under the control of a democracy has been taken away. So what we now have is a patina of democracy, but the bureaucracy in the government is fixed. So that's something quite interesting that has changed. So let's also think about questions of honesty. Being honest is always good. Is that truth? What is a society where everyone acts truthfully? Good and bad to discuss in that. What if we have the goals of a civil society fixed? Can they change? And can we argue against truth and propose that honesty itself may not achieve a civil purpose? I mean, they're all things we can look at. So should we reject truth in that case? Personally, I don't think so. I mean, I think we should strive for it. Whether we can achieve it is a different question.
Yeah, can I offer something which is just my whole reading of this is Socrates goes out and disproves every possible definition of justice, but at the end of the day, there's a system in place, and this is not so bad if the way that you define it is essentially, it almost depends on the circumstances, because if you have a system that includes, a judge, a jury of your peers, or whatever the details are, it's almost the structure that matters the most. So that you're kind of, so long as people are educated, and that seems to be an important part, that they're educated enough to make an intelligent decision, they can grapple with these basic questions in a court of law and come up with something in each case. In other words, it's like not about defining justice. It's having a structure and a system that actually functions to let people grapple with it while still coming up with whatever is the correct answer in each case. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think where I pointed out the wisdom of crowds as part of this as well, where we have a properly functioning, balanced democratic society, like a republic, etc., then what we're really looking at here is a system where the same as people guess the weight of a cow better, the guessing that creates common law, creates society, creates rules is better. So I'm a big fan of the common law for this reason. It's formed over many cases, small adjustments, incremental. And that's one of the problems that I'll keep pointing out. When a lot of progressives sit there going, we can change this, like the old Leninist, Mao, etc. We can just change society. Really? Can you? Can you just pick up and change it like that? When we have all these movements in the states at the moment going, we need to change this. Well, incremental change does work. The traditional liberal view is not of radical change. It is slow, incremental changes, testing, seeing, and it doesn't lead to the French Revolution. It leads to British Parliament, and the people sit there going, but that's boring. Not always boring, but generally doesn't seem to be exciting. I mean, some of the people
boring
may
and stable.
Yeah, exactly.
So that is, could I play on that then? Because the whole idea of common law seems like it's almost a Socratic dialogue that's taking place over centuries. It's people grappling with this, many different people over a very long period of time, grappling with these very questions.
I agree.
It doesn't necessarily mean that we always get it right. I mean, you look at something like To Kill a Mockingbird, where there was clearly, they went through the right process, but you could argue they got it completely wrong. But it's better than nothing, if you like. So
that also reminds me that this whole idea, the whole idea of the Western canon seems useful too in that respect. The idea of building on our trusted literature that we can all read, and so that we have an education that allows us to be aligned enough that we share enough definitions in common that we can actually have a dialogue and be speaking the same language and actually iterate our way into the future here. So that the having a standard canon for education, even if it's wrong, if it just allows us to be in alignment enough that we can actually talk about these issues and not be disagreeing about basic definitions, seems important too.
Correct. So the OED goes on to say that justice is a complex moral concept relating to human relationships generally, but closely associated with the operation of legal institutions, and that justice refers to fair treatment. Of course, we're also still in a circular argument looking at what's fair treatment, etc. But we're starting to get some ideas of what it might be. And I think one of the complex aspects of all of the nature of justice is that justice isn't personal. Justice is societal. So why can't I refer to justice? Because I'm part of a society. And if I'm going to define justice, I can't define justice for me. That's might is right, if I'm mighty. Otherwise, I'm complaining. So in what is justice, I will propose that justice is like wisdom of crowds, something that is an emergent property out of the concepts of many, many individuals, many people seeking their concept of fair, many people seeking to do right. So, can there be justice? I mean, what is justice? I think personally, the difficulty that we need to look at is, well, how do we define it? And that becomes something that many systems, many people work together to do. Laws aren't perfect, but we can change them over time in a democratic system. So let's now look at a little bit of a segue here. And Tolstoy and I also have very different ideas on a number of topics. I don't like his version of what art is. Tolstoy is probably very favorable to someone like Marx, but I would focus on more than, as he would, something that is unrefined. To Tolstoy, people learning to be sort of the pinnacle of ballet dancers or sopranos is bad. He would look at it and go, they're wasting their lives. They should have a proper life. Why are they doing this? Why are they causing themselves pain? But see, this is the difference between art and justice. It becomes something that word is difficult to define, difficult to see, and together we define it. It's the interaction of all of these things. So like justice, where we're putting out analogies, art in some ways is analogies, and different people end up having different concepts, you might say. So, I mean, looking at what a shepherd's art is, still art. To Tolstoy, he would say it's great, but I also happen to like opera, sometimes even an opera buffa. But we take Marx there, reducing in specialization to sort of the problems there. We end up, yes, we all live in a log cabin. We all seem to be living equally, but is that really something that we should aim for? Is the human condition in art or justice or aesthetics defined by what the lowest common denominator is? So then,
yeah, it's crazy. It's almost like with art, it's, you know, you can really, I think art is a huge component of education, actually, and in the work that we do, a lot of the times the creative process, you know, I feel like sometimes the work that I've done in engineering is almost a bit artful. You have to really think of things in an abstract way, and that to me really is what art is all about, is abstracting something from the real world and creating an image that somebody can look at and have something brought across to them through that medium. And that's really...
Yeah, it is a way of transmitting ideas without necessarily having words, something that helps educate and sets, well, cultural sort of aspects that bind society. And if we're going to have things like justice, then we need to actually bind society in the same concepts. We don't want too many differences. We want people to argue, but we don't want everyone having a completely sort of mirror image of what they believe. If we do, then we're not going to have a society that is really cohesive. So we want to try and find similarities as well as differences in any society. So let's go on a little bit further and have a look at, I mentioned war. We talked about that earlier. I've hinted at that already. And of course, the origins of war are always interesting. To Socrates, it's always from luxury. Socrates also thought that the ideal state was more like Sparta. The ideal state would have a philosopher king. Strange that Socrates was a philosopher. Interesting, that one. Plato, of course, put words in Socrates' mouth, so we don't know how much of this is Socrates versus Plato. But there are some arguments for and against the position. I just don't personally like the collectivist Marxist socialist theory. And I don't also believe that only wealth and luxury creates the inevitable sense of war. But and I don't believe that in eliminating luxury you get rid of war either. I mean, Sparta went to war all the time, but they didn't have a lot of luxury.
Yeah, I was about to say, you know, Sparta, they weren't even allowed to form wood or have any kind of art or any sort of luxury. Their money was not, you know, was this ruined kind of iron coinage, and they all ate the same thing every day, and they lived in the dark at night. So not really what you could consider luxury at all, and yet they were probably one of the most war-like states in that area. You know, that's what they're known for.
Exactly. They were magnificent warriors. But yeah. So I mean, Plato also talks about how once people get accustomed to luxury, it's nearly impossible to remove it. I mean, very few people had a flush toilet 100 years ago, yet now we'd sit there and go, there's not a toilet in here. I don't have an ensuite. And I have to walk down the hall. Yeah, I mean, well, welcome to modern. So, I mean, this is all how we really get into a change. And Marx, of course, is like many others, also Plato, who are utopians. Now, in the old utopian theory, what we're saying is society can be perfected. So we think that we can change people. And there was a very strong Lamarckian concept behind people like Lenin and Mao and even Stalin. What people don't realize, if you don't know some of the ideas like in the Sankhyaist, which was a idea like instead of genetics, it was epigenetics in a bad, unscientific manner, which was if you go to the gym and you become a bodybuilder, your children are more likely to have that trait. That's crap. I mean, really, it is. But Stalin, when he was actually trying to, like he was killing people, had the belief that he was doing it for their own good. Because by forcing them to pretend to be good Marxists, their children and their grandchildren would start to become Marxist genetically in their soul, so to speak. So human nature would be changed and we would have a perfected society. Now, I will reflect that differently with not only Orwell, but Huxley. Huxley thought that such a society stifles human creativity and in a way we devolve into a bestial conformity. So not only 1984, but if we think about Huxley and his utopian world, then, I mean, isn't that what we're doing now? In some ways, the idea of meta and they want to create this online environment where everyone lives in social media.
I saw a great picture that kind of defines meta really well, and it's this guy, and he's in this amazing universe, and everything is shiny, and then it pans to reality, and he's kind of sitting half naked in the corner of a room that's completely bare and in rags. And you can see that this is sort of what they're driving at.
I agree, but I'm sure old Zuckerberg will be fine. He'll be there in his sort of ultra wealthy pod, whatever he has. So
Zuckerberg has the ring of Gyges because he's invisible in the eyes of the Facebook users, but he can see all of us. We can't see him. So he got that problem going on.
So we're now in this post-Enlightenment liberal world. We have this concept of free speech that many of us have taken for granted, and that's become a problem. Now, we've now gotten into a post-free speech world where people are arguing censorship all over again, just like Socrates saying that censorship's not an evil to be avoided, but a necessity. Now, why do you think he might say that?
Well, it was, I mean, he's trying to construct his perfect society here. I mean, like, why? I mean, it's hard to agree with him. I don't agree with him at all because I can see so many problems with this idea. But
well, what happens in perfection? What does perfection?
It's like an S5 system in a factory, everything in its place and a place for everything. So every person in their chosen role, and never a want to move beyond or to do more.
So, we stifle change. We create something that has no innovation.
Static.
Rand wrote about a few of these things again, but the concept here is we stop any innovation, we stop any development, we stop any change. But we're in a changing world for a start. Every generation is going to be different, but sitting there going, oh, we can have it all the same. Well, we can't have it all the same. And how do we know we're right? I mean, think of the hubris in that. Going, I'm going to create a perfect society and apply it to everyone. I'm sorry, Mr. Stalin, you're an asshole. I'm sorry, Mr. Hitler, you're an asshole. I mean, this concept that you just, yeah, I mean, you don't know perfection, you're not perfect, and yet you expect that you're going to roll it out over everyone. Really?
It's interesting in the later books where he goes on with the allegory of the cave, and he's like, we must keep everyone in the cave watching the wall except the few who we select and who we will take out and show them the light so that they can come back down and keep everyone else looking at the wall, to make sure that we can retain what we have in this.
Yeah, so what people don't like is in a modern capitalistic society, things are Schumpeterian. They are dynamically changing, disruptive. So the people on top one day won't be the people on top tomorrow. Now, many people don't like this, but the people on top certainly don't like this. Because if you think about it, Zuckerberg is in a new empire that is quite big, like many other tech giants. But he's now hit a bit of a snag. How does he keep growing? He's losing people. These silly little things like TikTok are coming and taking people away from him. What do you do? So when you start thinking about that, if you make it static and you stop change, yay! All be in 15 version of Facebook, and that's our life as it is now for the rest of our life. Yippee freaking doodah. Yeah. So, sorry, not my way of doing things.
It also applies to the philosophers themselves. Like Plato, with his ideas, could also be, let's say at least updated, which of course has happened throughout history here. But it's not just the people that are rulers, but it's also the philosophers, which Plato puts the philosophers in the position of rulers. But anyway, it's
interesting though that like the evolution of technology back then was much slower than it was now. You know, there wasn't a man at the end of his life would not see that there was a whole lot of difference to things at the beginning of their life, whereas today almost everything that we touch and use was almost inconceivable 40 or 50 years ago.
I know that argument, but I disagree. I mean, art, other things changed. There's this, everything was static. But you look at the life of Socrates. He went through 7 or 8 political systems, wars, famines. They had the whole Pericles and Thucydides bit. You had, growth of art, growth of power in the state as Athens went from little to big, and that's one man's life. That doesn't sound too static. I mean, they brought in goods from like Thebes and other places that changed the definition of what they were creating. They changed their art. So, I mean, the buildings stayed the same, but that's because they're big rock things and they're hard to move.
True.
And they're the state buildings. They're not the people's buildings. Think of Rome. Everyone remembers, these big columns. They forget most of the buildings were wood. I mean, sometimes 5-story wooden apartment blocks that often burnt down, but none of those survive now. So we can sit there and talk about what it was like and think, look at all these wonderful stone buildings, and forget actually most people were in apartments, like 5-story apartments like we have now.
Right.
So we've got to think that many of these mythologies that we have about how we're so different aren't. Think back even 200 years. Things weren't as fast back then. But imagine you're in a small village and suddenly there's a railroad and then there's a telegraph. Isn't that going to change your whole philosophy of life completely? It used to take me
Yes. Yeah.
6 hours to walk down just down the road to the next village. Now I can go halfway across the country.
Yeah.
So,
and messages moved at the speed of a horseback
exactly.
postal service.
Yep.
Well,
So
even
all
more,
these
that's
things
another-
keep changing.
Yeah. Yeah, just to, I mean, just to bring it back to the social media idea too, because think about how rapidly that causes change. When we've got these, we can now send information very, very quickly around the world, but then the censorship of these platforms, call it whatever you want to, but deleting, part of the dialogue here, is changing things for many, many people, billions of people, very, very quickly. So the changes are faster than railroads.
Yeah. And there's more people, more than anything else.
Yeah.
More people, more ideas. So let's have a look at a different idea. So should we seek justice in the state and not the man? Now, the Republic really has the concept of the state is the foundation of sort of justice and how it's felt. And this is why Socrates was willing to actually give his life, even though he didn't agree with what was happening. Now, the distinction is, I agree in the state as well, but now we have to get into the definition of the state. So we move away from the definition of justice. And at that point, I would say a well-defined civic institution that is democratically managed, where we have protections for the people, protections for the aristocratic class, whether that's sort of traditional landholders or capitalists, protections for innovations and institutions, a common law type system that changes over time, the ability for people to vote, the ability for a jury, yada, yada, yada. In which case, I have said a particular type of state. Now, I can conversely say North Korea, and I would disagree with that being just, in that people don't have equal opportunities or fair opportunities to get justice. The ruler has a different justice to the people, and I don't see that as fair. So if everyone, I mean, but you have more money, that's a different argument. It's harder for you or it's easier for you. They're different arguments. But if every one of us has the same ability to stand up in front of a judge with the same evidence and have the same result, then we have a different case and we have equality under the law. And equality under the law doesn't mean we're all equal. It means we each have the right, whether we are Boris Johnson or some guy in a coal mine or myself or any of you, to go to court and to have our case heard. So,
yes, I agree with that.
Once again, we get into different definitions, but we even have to think about what we define as our state, if we're going to say state. So everyone runs around in anarchist world and in crypto anarchy going, you can't have a state. But what do you have? I mean, think about it for a moment. If you let Jack Dorsey and Zuckerberg and a whole lot of crypto idiots define everything in a DAO, and usually badly because someone will hack it, then what you end up with is rule by hackers, rule by power, rule by wealth. Think about it. If you have that, what it really says is if someone wealthy has their money stolen, you can reverse the DAO and change it. But if someone poor, well, poor people, they should have protected themselves better. That doesn't sound like a good society to me. I mean, this concept of, oh, but there's a smart contract. Oh, so what? Contracts are between humans, not computers. That's simple. So, as we're finishing up this lesson, I've left the normal questions here. So, in the Republic, what does Cephalus understand to be the benefits and advantages of old age? Anyone remember that one? From their reading?
Yeah, he becomes less sensitive as he gets older. Like he thinks that's a good thing. Like he's less sex drive and things like this that he peculiarly defines to be good. Is that correct?
Yeah, the passions are lessened. Ring of Gyges, corrupting force. Can any power be wielded without an effect on the holder?
We didn't talk about this, but I completely buy. I mean, we talked about it. We didn't dive into it in detail, but it strikes me that the ring of Gyges would inevitably corrupt anyone that held it, and that's what's going on with Mark Zuckerberg, and that's why I give that as an example. I think that's exactly what's going on, and we can see this happening right now. That Mark Zuckerberg has created the ring of Gyges for himself, and he's corrupted himself because that's what he did. And I believe the same thing would happen to anyone. And this is relevant to Bitcoin. That you and I have talked about this extensively, Craig, but then for anybody following along who can't connect the dots, Bitcoin is transparent to everybody because it's not encrypted. The logs are there for everybody to see. It actually encourages the opposite of the ring of Gyges. It encourages a world of transparency where these logs are available for anybody to see what's going on.
And that's the difference in power. So to quote Lord Aitken, which I haven't chucked into here, but power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. It's a longer quote than that, but that's the bit everyone takes. So the ring of Gyges is a corrupting force, not because it's powerful, but because it allows people not to have any oversight. If people can't see the person with the ring of Gyges, there's no review. People can get away with whatever they want. So remember what Plato argued was the origin of the state?
I do not remember. What was that one?
It was the need for people to rely on other people to have the necessities of life. And so
yes,
the need
as we want more, as we specialize in Smithian sense, as we become more than a village and a series of bare sort of essentials, and we want to protect ourselves and create insurance and et cetera, et cetera. So the origin of the state is, in a way, similar to what Hobbes would argue in Leviathan. It's this contract we make between different individuals. Rousseau would have a similar argument as well. So jump 2 questions here about ethics as an exact science and morality. Can we objectively argue morality? I mean, they're really both related. So opinions?
Yeah, I mean, well, this is, in a way, this is the whole point of all this, is to ask this question. I mean, well, I'll phrase you, Craig. I took what you said in Slack a week or 2 ago seriously, which is something like, again, I don't mean to put words in your mouth. If I say it wrong, just correct me, but something like, you believe there is such a thing as objective truth that can be arrived at in a probabilistic way, which is an interesting way of kind of unifying subjectivity and objectivity. So perhaps ethics falls into this category, that there is such a thing, but we're never quite there. And so what we can do is grapple with it. We can do the Socratic dialogue. We can believe there is such a thing, but we can also not be totally sure about what it is and just keep trying to arrive at it. That's the best answer I have. I think that's your answer.
I also think it is wisdom of crowds and the group of a society, as all in that society form something that is their morality and their ethics, and that will change over time. So as we have new people born, some people die, some people leave, some people migrate, then society changes, and so does the underlying morality. And that's something we need to think about. So does art, so does all of these other things that reflect that. So I won't go into the question there. I'll leave that for you. You can post it in Slack for the questions asked. But what do you think about the idea of classes? So old Plato there said we should have a warrior class separate from the rest of society. You agree with that one?
No. I mean, that's the part that is like, as soon as I start reading this stuff, it is so blatantly, it is so in contradiction with my way of being. I'm horrified to hear Plato take these ideas seriously. So I do not agree at all. And that's where it's like, it just makes me, kind of be alert and think, how could anybody believe this? And the best answer I have is what you said earlier, Craig, which is,
but we have societies now. Look at North Korea.
I know. That sounds
Isn't there
I
mean, you get the guys in the nice uniforms who goose step, and remember Libya before they had a whole lot of trouble over there? Yeah. You had Gaddafi all spruced up, and his medals, like I survived going to the bathroom medal. I wiped my ass by myself. and all the other things that he had, like the gold braids to show that once upon a time he stubbed his toe.
Yeah, it's interesting. I have a brother in the armed services, and you know, to try and imagine what it would be like if, you know, the way Plato sort of approaches this is that, we need to identify the people early in life who have the aptitude and the want, or not. No, it's not necessarily even the want. It's who have the aptitude and the nature to be good at this, and then take them away from everybody else and make them our military. And it's kind of counter to everything that we have today, which is that you get to have the choice. And really what he's saying here is that nobody should have a choice into what they do. It's like there's a movie, City of Ember, which is it's a bit of a kid's movie, but there's this great scene where they're giving everybody their career, and you know, they're essentially picking it out of a hat and going, oh, you're a potato peeler, oh, you're going to work in the sewers, oh, you're off to work in the generator. And nobody actually ends up with the right to have any say in what they end up doing. And this is what I think is fundamentally the problem with what Plato proposes here.
Definitely. I mean, someone else doesn't always make the best choice for us. And even if we do, it doesn't always work out that way. So let's have a look at the idea of censorship in poetry and the arts. So Plato thought that we should stop poetry and the arts, maybe allow, like Tolstoy wanted, arts by the peasant class, people who aren't trained. So if you're a blacksmith, then you can go out there and paint in watercolors if that's really what you want to do. But as long as you don't do it too much and you don't get too good, no specialization here. So why do you think that might be the problem? What do you think things like, especially back then, poetry and the arts, but now theater, movies, other things would really, why would that be a problem?
Well, it's the same as what you said with Plato has created this world of stagnant, you know, he doesn't believe in change. So if you squash human creativity before it even has a chance here, you're not allowing for change. So you're going to create a stagnant society.
Yes, and people, of course, want that. There are many people throughout society, around the world now, throughout history, who actually don't want change anymore. They want it to stay the same. Don't change.
Because they're at the top, and it's working well for them.
Exactly. They're happy, don't change. So, final question. Our education, what are the two types that he represents there?
He just has what he calls it music, which he, you know, says, oh, this includes like literature, and gymnastic, so the physical training, and that's really all that he thinks that they need. So
because you'll be a good soldier, or a good artisan, or a good, as in making woodwork, or a good pot maker, or
It's interesting that he doesn't recognize that there's art in being an artisan, and that
I know
you must understand the art of your craft in order to be good at it.
Yep.
You know, we can't have nice buildings without architects who understand that there is both art and structure in a building. You know, otherwise you just end up with, you know, everything the same everywhere.
Yep. I agree. All right. So any other questions, or are we done for the night?
I would just say you can cut this part out if you want, but it just appears to me that the systems, even back this far, were not broken. They were literally built and designed this way to keep people from being a heart-activated, earth-connected human being on this planet. They wanted people in these societies that are cut off from that passion being ignited in a human, that you know, nature-based societies didn't have all these problems that these societies had. So to me, you know, and a lot of my research with indigenous research and stuff is something happens to a human when their, you know, heart and their passion is activated, and, you know, a culture that has a whole bunch of heart-centered activated people would never stand for these systems that were in place, which is why they had to keep people from being able to, activate that and whatnot. So I don't know if I'm
Well,
explaining
another
that
thing
right,
to
but,
think about is, I mean, remember who Socrates said should be the king.
Himself.
I mean,
Socrates.
well, he said philosopher kings. The philosophers should be the rulers because we know the most. Sounds like every intellectual, doesn't it? So philosophy was a classic left liberal who could redo society. I mean, there are many, many good things about Socrates, and Plato, but one of them was the typical, "Hey, I can change everything for the better."
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, Mao said he could change everything for the better, and a few tens of millions of people later, and Stalin did the same. I'll make you all compete, and the kulaks can all earn money. Now that you've earned some money, you're a capitalist, and I'm going to kill you. Yay!
Mhm.
Thank you.
And some of those people are well intentioned, but some of them are not, which I think is what you're saying. Like, so some of these people, they do this intentionally because they don't care about what's just or whatever. That's not a question on their mind at all. They're doing this on purpose.
Yep, I agree.
I thought it was interesting. One of the things that Plato also said was that the people who rule should be the ones who least want to rule. And I kind of very much question that. Why would you want someone leading who does not want to lead? Because they're not going to be in the mindset of making decisions and bringing things forward because they simply don't want to be there, and they're thinking about other things and thinking about, geez, I'd rather be somewhere else doing something else than having to deal with this. And yeah, it's certainly a lot of flaws in his approach, I think.
Yep. All right. Thank you again for another evening, and till next time.